Kappa Ryunosuke Akutagawa. This is a story told by a patient in a mental hospital, patient number 23. He's probably over 30, but at first glance, he seems like a very youthful madman. His life experiences? No, never mind that. He just sits there, hugging his knees, occasionally glancing out the window. Outside the barred window, a single oak tree, devoid even of dead leaves, stretched its branches against the snowy, overcast sky. He recounted this story at length to Drives, the hospital director, and to me. He wasn't entirely without gestures. For example, when he said, "I was surprised," he would suddenly throw his head back. AC. Iaffa tried to transcribe his story fairly accurately. If anyone finds my transcription inadequate, I suggest they visit the S mental hospital in XX village, outside Tokyo. Patient number 23, who looks younger than his age, will most likely bow politely and point to a chair without a cushion. Then, with a melancholic smile, he will quietly repeat this story. Finally, I remember the look on his face when he finished this story. The moment he straightened up, he would immediately start waving his fists and shout at anyone within earshot, "Get out! You scoundrel! You're just another stupid, jealous, obscene, impudent, conceited, cruel, parasitic animal. Get out! You scoundrel!" Chapter 1. It happened 3 years ago in the summer. I, like anyone else, shouldered my rucksack and set out to climb Mount Hotoka from the hot spring inn in Kamekochi. As you know, the only way to climb Mount Hotoka is to go upstream along the Aizawa River. I had climbed Mount Hotoka before, and even Mount Yari, so I ascended the Aizawa River Valley, shrouded in morning mist, without a guide. The Aizawa River Valley, shrouded in morning mist, but the mist showed no sign of clearing. In fact, it grew even thicker. After walking for about an hour, I considered turning back to the hot spring inn in Kamekochi. But even to return to Kamekochi, I'd have to wait for the fog to lift. And the fog only grew thicker with each passing moment. Oh well, I might as well keep climbing. Thinking this, I pushed my way through the bamboo grass, keeping the Aizawa River Valley close by. However, my vision remained obstructed by the thick fog. Although I did occasionally glimpse thick beech and fir branches, their leaves drooping darkly from the mist. Then again, grazing horses and cows would suddenly appear before me, only to vanish instantly back into the dense fog. As my legs grew tired, my stomach began to rumble. To make matters worse, my climbing clothes and blanket, soaked through with mist, felt incredibly heavy. I finally gave up and decided to descend to the Aizawa River Valley, guided by the sound of water rushing against the rocks. I sat down on a rock by the water's edge and started to eat. I opened a can of corned beef, gathered some dead branches, and started a fire. All this must have taken a good 10 minutes. During that time, the persistently malicious fog began to thin slightly. As I bit into my bread, I glanced at my wristwatch. It was already past 1:20. But what surprised me more was a strange face that flickered across the glass of my round wristwatch. Startled, I turned around. And then that was the very first time I saw a kappa. There, on a rock behind me, sat a kappa, just like in the pictures. One hand gripped the trunk of a white birch, the other shielded its eyes as it peered down at me curiously. I was dumbfounded, frozen for a moment. The kappa, also seemingly surprised, didn't even move the hand shielding its eyes. Suddenly, I sprang to my feet and leaped towards the kappa on the rock. At the same time, the kappa fled. Or rather, it seemed to flee. In a flash, it dodged me and vanished. Astonished, I searched the bamboo grass. There it was, crouched down a few meters away, looking back at me. That wasn't strange in itself. But what surprised me was the color of the kappa's skin. The kappa I had seen on the rock had been grayish. Now, its whole body was green. I yelled, "Damn it," and lunged at the kappa again. Of course, it fled. For the next 30 minutes, I relentlessly pursued the kappa, crashing through bamboo grass and scrambling over rocks. Kappas are as quick on their feet as monkeys. In my frantic chase, I lost sight of it several times. I also slipped and tumbled more than once. But when I reached a large oak tree with thick, spreading branches, I was fortunate enough to find a grazing cow blocking the kappa's path. And it was a bull, with thick horns and bloodshot eyes. The kappa, upon seeing the bull, let out a cry and dove headfirst into a particularly tall patch of bamboo grass. I thought, Agiaf got it, and instantly gave chase. There must have been a hidden hole there, because the moment my fingers brushed against the kappa's slippery back, I plummeted into deep darkness. But even in such a perilous moment, the human mind wanders to the most absurd things. As I fell, I remembered a bridge near the hot spring inn in Kamikochi called Kappa Bridge. And then, I don't remember anything else. I only felt something like lightning flash before my eyes, and I lost consciousness. Chapter 2. When I finally came to, I was lying on my back, surrounded by a crowd of kappas. One kappa, wearing pince-nez perched on its beak-like snout, was kneeling beside me, pressing a stethoscope to my chest. Seeing that I had opened my eyes, the kappa gestured for me to be quiet and then called out quacks, quacks to someone behind him. 2 kappas appeared, carrying a stretcher. I was placed on the stretcher and carried silently for several blocks through the throng of kappas. The streets lining my route looked remarkably like Ginza Street. Awnings shaded various shops beneath rows of beech trees, and automobiles drove along the tree-lined streets. Presently, the stretcher carrying me turned down a narrow side street and was carried into a house. I later learned that this was the home of the kappa with the pince-nez at a doctor named Chuck. Chuck laid me down on a neat little bed and gave me a glass of clear, watery medicine to drink. I lay in bed, passively submitting to Chuck's ministrations. In truth, my body ached so badly I could barely move. Chuck came to examine me 2 or 3 times a day. Every 3 days or so, the kappa I had first encountered, a fisherman named Bag, would also visit. Kappas know far more about humans than humans know about kappas. This is probably because kappas capture humans far more often than humans capture kappas. Even if agapturia isn't the right word, humans, like myself, have frequently visited the kappa country. Many have even lived there their entire lives. And why is that, you ask? We are able to live without working simply by virtue of being human, not kappa. In fact, according to Bag, a young road worker, having also stumbled into this country by chance, married a female kappa and lived here until he died. It seems that the female kappa was considered the most beautiful in the land, and was remarkably adept at deceiving her road worker husband. After about a week, according to the laws of this country, I was designated a special protected resident and given a house next to Chuck's. My house, although small, was quite elegantly furnished. The civilization of this country isn't much different from that of the human world, at least not from that of Japan. In the corner of the living room, which faced the street, stood a small piano, and etchings hung in frames on the walls. However, since the house itself, as well as the tables and chairs, were all scaled to kappa size, I felt like I was living in a Childaf's playroom, which was rather inconvenient. Every evening at dusk, I would welcome Chuck and Bag to my house to learn the kappa language. They weren't my only visitors. Everyone was curious about me, the special protected resident, so people like Gal, the president of a glass company, who would come by to have his blood pressure checked, would also visit. However, during the first 2 weeks or so, the one I became closest to was Bag, the fisherman. One mild evening, I was sitting at the table with Bag. Suddenly, he fell silent, his large eyes widening as he stared intently at me. Naturally, I found this strange, so I said, "Quacks, Bag, quo quel, Quan?" This translates to, "Hey, Bag, what's wrong?" But Bag didn't answer. Instead, he abruptly stood up, stuck out his tongue, and looked as if he was about to jump at me like a frog. This unnerved me, so I quietly stood up from my chair and prepared to dash to the door. Luckily, just then, Dr. Chuck appeared. "Hey, Bag, what are you doing?" Chuck, his pince-nez still perched on his nose, glared at Bag. Bag, looking intimidated, repeatedly touched his head and apologized to Chuck. "I'm terribly sorry. I was just having a bit of fun, trying to scare him. Please forgive me." Chapter 3. Before I continue, I must explain what a kappa is. Whether kappas actually exist is still debated, but since I lived among them, I can assure you there's no room for doubt. So, what kind of creatures are they? They have short hair on their heads, and, like descriptions in books such as Suiko Koryaku, A Brief Study of Water Imps, their hands and feet are webbed. They're about a meter tall, give or take. According to Dr. Chuck, they weigh between 20 and 30 pounds. Although rare, large kappas weighing over 50 pounds have been known to exist. They have an oval dish on top of their heads, which seems to harden with age. Bagaf's dish, for instance, felt quite different from young Chukuf's. But the strangest thing about kappas is their skin color. Unlike us humans, their skin doesn't have a fixed color. It changes to match their surroundings. For example, when the Yafre in the grass, they turn green like grass, and when the Yafre on rocks, they turn gray like rocks. This, of course, isn't unique to kappas. Chameleons do it too. Perhaps kappas have something similar to chameleons in their skin tissue. When I discovered this, I recalled folklore that said kappas in western Japan are green, while those in the northeast are red. I also remembered how, when I was chasing Bag, he suddenly disappeared. Kappas seem to have a thick layer of fat beneath their skin. Despite the relatively low temperature of their underground world, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, they don't wear any clothes. Of course, they all wear glasses, carry cigarette cases, and have wallets. But kappas have pouches on their bellies like kangaroos, so they don't have any trouble storing these items. The only thing I found strange was that they don't cover their waists. I once asked Bag about this custom. He just threw his head back and laughed and laughed. Then he replied, "I find it strange that you cover yours." Chapter 4. As I gradually learned the Kappa language, I came to understand their customs and habits. The strangest of these was their tendency to find amusing what humans consider serious, and to take seriously what humans find amusing. For example, humans take things like justice and humanity seriously. But kappas, upon hearing such things, burst into laughter. Their sense of humor is completely different from ours. I once discussed birth control with Dr. Chuck. He opened his mouth wide and laughed so hard his pince-nez nearly fell off. Annoyed, I asked him what was so funny. I remember his reply being something like this, although some of the details might be wrong. After all, I hadn't yet mastered the Kappa language. It's just funny how you only consider the parents' convenience. Itaf's so selfish. On the other hand, from a human perspective, nothing is more comical than Kappa childbirth. Sometime later, I went to Bag's hut to observe the birth of his child. Kappas, like humans, require the assistance of a doctor or midwife during childbirth. But when a Kappa is about to give birth, the father puts his mouth to the mother's reproductive organ, as if making a phone call, and asks in a loud voice, "Have you carefully considered whether or not you want to be born into this world?" Bag, kneeling, repeated this question several times. Then he gargled with some antiseptic solution that was on the table. The child in his wife's belly, apparently feeling a bit pressured, replied in a small voice, "I don't want to be born. First of all, my father's genes carry a predisposition to mental illness. Besides, I believe Kappa existence is inherently flawed." When Bag heard this reply, he scratched his head sheepishly. But the midwife immediately inserted a thick glass tube into the wife's reproductive organ and injected some liquid. The wife let out a sigh of relief. At the same time, her large belly deflated like a balloon with its hydrogen gas released. Kappa children, as evidenced by this pre-birth dialogue, can walk and talk as soon as they are born. According to Chuck, there was even a case of a child lecturing on the existence of God 26 days after birth. However, that child apparently died 2 months later. Since we're on the subject of childbirth, let me tell you about a large poster I happened to see on a street corner 3 months after arriving in this country. The poster depicted a dozen or so kappas, some blowing trumpets, others wielding swords. Above them, spiral kappa characters, resembling clock springs, covered the surface. The spiral writing translated roughly to the following. Again, some details may be incorrect, but I diligently noted down the words as my companion, a Kappa student named Lap, read them aloud seeking genetic volunteers. Healthy Kappa men and women, to eradicate bad genes. Marry unhealthy Kappa men and women. Of course, I told Lap that such things don't happen in our world. Lap, along with all the other Kappas nearby, burst into laughter. Agdenaft happen? But according to you, you humans do something similar. Why do you think your sons fall in love with maids, and your daughters with chauffeurs? It's all an unconscious effort to eradicate bad genes. Besides, compared to the volunteer armies you described, the ones that kill each other to seize a single railroad, Our volunteer army is far more noble, wouldn't you say? Lap said this seriously, but his stout belly shook with laughter. I, far from laughing, suddenly tried to grab a nearby Kappa. Taking advantage of my distraction, the Kappa had stolen my fountain pen. However, slippery-skinned Kappas aren't easily caught. The Kappa slipped through my grasp and darted away, its mosquito-thin body leaning forward as if about to topple over. Chapter 5. I became quite close to Lap, the Kappa student, almost as close as to Bag. But what I remember most vividly is my introduction to a Kappa named Talk. Talk was a poet among the Kappas. Like human poets, he wore his hair long. I would often visit Tokaf's house to relieve my boredom. Talk always had pots of alpine plants arranged in his small room, where he would write poetry, smoke, and generally live a carefree existence. In the corner of the room, a female Kappa, Talk was a free love advocate and didn't have a wife, would be knitting or doing some other handiwork. Talk would always greet me with a smile. Kappa smiles aren't particularly pleasant. At least, I found them rather unnerving at first. "Oh, hello there. Come in, come in. Have a seat." Talk often talked about Kappa life and Kappa art. According to him, nothing was more absurd than ordinary Kappa life. Parents, spouses, siblings, they all seemed to live solely for the pleasure of tormenting each other. The family system, he declared, was the height of absurdity. One day, Talk pointed out the window and said with disgust, "Look at that absurdity." Outside, on the street, a young Kappa was struggling to walk, weighed down by 7 or 8 male and female Kappas hanging around his neck, presumably his parents and relatives. I, however, was impressed by the young Kappaf's spirit of self-sacrifice, and praised his fortitude. "Gumph, you are frey qualified to become a citizen of this country. By the way, are you a socialist?" I naturally replied Agqua, which means a Gaiasa in the Kappa language. Then you wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice a single genius for the sake of 100 ordinary people, would you? Agso, what are you? Someone said your beliefs are anarchistic. Agme. IFM a Superman, or, literally translated, a super Kappa. Talk declared this proudly. He also held unique views on art. He believed art should be free from any constraints, art for art's sake. Therefore, an artist must first and foremost be a Superman, transcending good and evil. This wasn't just Tokaf's opinion, most of his fellow poets seemed to agree. I often accompanied him to the Superman Club. The Superman Club was a gathering of poets, novelists, playwrights, critics, painters, musicians, sculptors, and art enthusiasts. They were all supermen. They chatted animatedly in the brightly lit salon, and occasionally showcased their Superman abilities. For instance, one sculptor, surrounded by potted ferns, captured a young Kappa and openly engaged in pederasty. Another, a female novelist, stood on a table and drank 60 bottles of absinthe. However, upon finishing the 60th bottle, she rolled off the table and promptly died. One beautiful moonlit night, I walked home from the Superman Club, arm in arm with Talk. He was unusually quiet and withdrawn. We passed a small, firelit window. Inside, a Kappa couple and their 3 children sat around a dinner table. Talk sighed and suddenly spoke. I consider myself a superhuman romantic, but when I see such domestic scenes, I cannot help but feel envious. But don't you think that's contradictory? Talk stood still in the moonlight, arms crossed, gazing at the small window, at the peaceful dinner table of the 5 Kappas. After a moment, he replied, that armlet over there looks far more hygienic than love, wouldn't you say? Chapter 6. Kappa romance is quite different from human romance. When a female Kappa finds a desirable male, she will stop at nothing to capture him. The most straightforward female Kappa will relentlessly pursue him. I actually witnessed a female Kappa chasing a male Kappa like a madwoman. And not just her parents and siblings joined the chase. The poor male Kappa, after being chased mercilessly, even if he manages to escape capture, ends up bedridden for 2 or 3 months. I was at home one day, reading a collection of Tokaf's poems, when Lap, the student, burst in. He collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. "It's terrible. I have been captured." I instinctively threw down the book and bolted the door. Peeking through the keyhole, I saw a short female kappa, her face smeared with sulfur powder, still lurking outside. Lap stayed at my place for several weeks after that. Eventually, his beak rotted and fell off. There are, of course, some male kappas who eagerly chase females. But even then, it's often because the female kappa has cleverly manipulated them into doing so. I have seen male kappas frantically chasing female kappas, who, during their flight, would occasionally stop or crawl on all fours, as if to taunt their pursuer. Then, at just the right moment, they would feign exhaustion and allow themselves to be caught. The male kappa I saw, after embracing the female, rolled around on the ground for a while. When he finally got up, his expression was a mixture of disappointment, regret, a truly pitiful sight. But that wasn't the worst of it. I also witnessed a small male kappa chasing a female. The female kappa was engaging in her usual seductive flight, when a large male kappa strode towards them, snorting. The female, upon noticing the large male, cried out, "Help! He's trying to kill me." The large male kappa immediately seized the small kappa and pinned him to the ground. The small kappa clawed at the air a few times before dying. But by then, the female kappa was already clinging tightly to the large kappa's neck. Every male kappa I knew was relentlessly pursued by female kappas. Even Bag, with his wife and children, was not spared. He was captured 2 or 3 times. Only Mag, the philosopher, who lived next to Talk, was never captured. This was partly due to his exceptional ugliness. But it was also because he rarely left his house. I sometimes visited Mag to chat. He would always be in his dimly lit room, a 7-colored stained glass lantern casting its glow, sitting at a high desk, engrossed in thick books. I once discussed Kappa romance with him. Agui dusnaft the government crack down on female kappas chasing males. Agits because there aren't many female kappas in government. Female kappas are even more jealous than males. If there were more female officials, male kappas would probably be less harassed. But even that wouldn't solve the problem entirely. Because even among officials, the females chase the males, you see. Agso, someone like you is the happiest of all, then. Mag left his chair, took my hands in his, and sighed. Aguafree not a kappa, so you would not understand. But even I, sometimes, yearn to be chased by those terrifying females. Chapter 7. I also frequently attended concerts with Talk. But the one I'll never forget is the third concert I went to. The concert hall was not much different from those in Japan. 300 or 400 male and female kappas sat in tiered seats, programs in hand, listening intently. At this third concert, I was sitting in the front row with Talk, his female companion, and Mag. After a cello solo, a kappa with unusually narrow eyes casually strolled onto the stage, clutching a score. According to the program, this was the renowned composer Krabak. According to the program, well, I didn't need the program. Krabak was a member of Talk's Superman Club, so I recognized him. Lied. Krabak, programs in this country were mostly in German. Krabak bowed briefly to the enthusiastic applause and sat down at the piano. He began to play his own Lied, casually, as if it were nothing special. According to Talk, Krabak was a genius without equal among kappa composers. I was interested in Krabak's music and his lyrical poetry, so I listened intently to the rich sounds of the grand piano. Talk and Mag were perhaps even more enraptured than I. However, the beautiful, at least according to the kappas, female kappa beside Talk gripped her program tightly and occasionally stuck out her long tongue as if in annoyance. According to Mag, she had failed to capture Krabak 10 years earlier and still held a grudge against him. Krabak played with passion, his whole body swaying as he battled the piano. Suddenly, a voice boomed through the hall like thunder, "Stop playing." Startled, I instinctively looked back. The voice belonged to a tall policeman sitting in the back row. When I turned around, he was calmly seated, and he shouted again, even louder this time, "Stop playing." And then, chaos erupted. Police brutality. Krabak, play. Play. Idiot. Bastard. Get out. Don't give in. Shouts filled the air as chairs toppled, programs flew, and someone started throwing cider bottles, stones, and even half-eaten cucumbers. Dumbfounded, I tried to ask Talk what was going on. But he, too, was agitated, standing on his chair, yelling, "Acrobat, play, play," or even Talk's female companion, seemingly forgetting her animosity, was yelling Agpolice brutality are just like Talk. I turned to Mag. "What's happening? This is a common occurrence here. You see, paintings and literaturiac." Mag ducked slightly every time something flew past, calmly continuing his explanation. Paintings and literature clearly express something that everyone can understand, so the Yafre never banned in this country. Instead, we have performance bans. After all, even music that corrupts public morals is imperceptible to Kappas without ears. But does that policeman have ears? Well, that's debatable. Perhaps the melody reminded him of his heartbeat while he was in bed with his wife. The commotion only intensified. Krabak remained at the piano, glaring defiantly at the audience. But even with his defiance, he couldn't avoid the projectiles flying his way. Every few seconds, his dignified posture was momentarily disrupted. But for the most part, he maintained his composure, his narrow eyes narrowed even further in anger. I, too, was using Talk as a shield against the flying debris. But driven by curiosity, I kept talking to Mag. Agesnaft that kind of censorship outrageous. Agwat. Itaf's far more progressive than censorship in other countries. Take XX, for example. Just last month Just as he said this, a bottle struck Mag on the head. He cried out quack. A mere interjection, and lost consciousness. Chapter 8. I, strangely, had taken a liking to Gal, the president of the glass company. He was the quintessential capitalist. Of all the Kappas in this country, probably none had a larger belly than Gal. But sitting in his easy chair, flanked by his lychee-like wife and cucumber-like children, he seemed the embodiment of contentment. I often dined at Garloff's house with Judge Pep and Dr. Chuck. I also used Garloff's letters of introduction to visit various factories in which he and his friends had some interest. Of all the factories, the most interesting to me was the book manufacturing plant. As I entered the factory with a young Kappa engineer and observed the massive, hydroelectrically powered machinery, I was once again struck by the advanced state of Kappa mechanical engineering. They claimed to produce 7 million books a year. But what amazed me wasn't the quantity, but the ease with which they produced them. To make a book, they simply fed paper, ink, and a grayish powder into the funnel-shaped mouth of a machine. In less than 5 minutes, these materials were transformed into countless books of various sizes. I watched the books cascading from the machine like a waterfall and asked the bow-legged Kappa engineer what the grey powder was. He stood before the gleaming machine and replied listlessly, It's donkey brains. Dried and powdered, of course. Currently selling at 2 or 3 sen per ton. Such industrial miracles weren't limited to book manufacturing. Similar processes were used in painting and music production. In fact, according to Gal, an average of 700 or 800 new machines were invented in this country every month, steadily increasing mass production without the need for manual labor. Consequently, 400,000 or 500,000 workers were laid off each month. Yet, reading the morning newspaper, I never once encountered the word agstrike. I found this odd, so I asked about it during another dinner at Garloff's house. They eat them, you see. Gal, puffing on his after-dinner cigar, said this casually. But I didn't understand what a jeet thema meant. Chuck, noticing my confusion, interjected. They kill the workers and use their flesh for food. Look at this newspaper. This month, exactly 64,769 workers were laid off, so the price of meat has gone down accordingly. The workers are killed without protest. Thereaf's no point in protesting. Thereaf's a worker slaughter law. This was Pep, the judge, speaking from behind a potted cornelian cherry, a grim expression on his face. I was disgusted, of course. But Gal, Pep, and Chuck seemed to consider it perfectly normal. Chuck even laughed as he spoke to me, a hint of mockery in his voice. Agit saves the country the trouble of dealing with starvation and suicides. They just make them inhale some poisonous gas. Itaf's quite painless, you see. Agbut eating their fleshika. Agden be sentimental. Mag would have a good laugh if he heard you say that. In your country, Don aft lower-class girls become prostitutes. Getting upset about eating workers is just sentimentalism. Gal, listening to this exchange, offered me a plate of sandwiches from the nearby table and said calmly, "Ag care for one. The Yafre made with worker meat, you know. I was thoroughly repulsed. I couldn't bear to stay any longer. Ignoring the laughter of Pep and Chuck, I fled from Garloff's living room. It was a stormy night, the sky devoid of stars. As I walked home through the darkness, I vomited repeatedly, the pale vomit gleaming in the darkness. Chapter 9. Despite everything, Gal, the president of the glass company, was an affable Kappa. I often accompanied him to his club, where we spent many pleasant evenings. This was partly because his club was far more welcoming than Tokaf's Superman Club. Also, while Garloff's conversations lacked the depth of Mag's philosophical discussions, they offered me a glimpse into a new and wider world. Gal, stirring his coffee with a solid gold spoon, would regale me with stories. One foggy evening, I was listening to Garloff's stories, a vase of winter roses between us. I seemed to recall the room being decorated in the Secession style, with white walls, chairs, and tables trimmed with thin gold lines. Gal, a smug smile on his face, spoke of the Korax party cabinet, which was then in power. Korax is a meaningless interjection, roughly translating to "oh, well." But it was the name of the ruling political party, whose slogan was "for the benefit of all Kappas." The Korax party is controlled by the renowned politician Lop. "Honesty is the best policy" is a saying attributed to Bismarck, isn't it? Well, Lop applies honesty to domestic affairs as well. But Lop's speech sack. Now, listen to me. His speeches are, of course, all lies. But everyone knows that, so it amounts to the same thing as honesty. Calling them lies is just your human prejudice. We Kappas, unlike you, but never mind that. I want to talk about Lop. Lop controls the Korax party, and Lop is controlled by Quickie, the president of the Pufu newspaper. Pufu is also a meaningless interjection, roughly equivalent to "oh." But even Quickie isn't his own master. Quickie is controlled by yours truly, Gal. And please forgive my rudeness, the Pufu newspaper supports the workers. It's strange that its president, Quickie, is under your control. Gal continued to smile, toying with his gold spoon. Looking at him, I felt more sympathy for the Pufu reporters than resentment towards Gal. Gal, seemingly sensing my unspoken sympathy, puffed out his large belly and said, "Well, not all Pufu reporters support the workers. After all, we Kappas, before supporting anyone else, support ourselves. But what off's even more troublesome is that even I, Gal, am under someone else's control. Who do you think that is? It's my wife, the beautiful Mrs. Gal." Gal laughed heartily. That sounds rather fortunate. AGM content, at any rate. But I can only admit this freely to you, a non-Kappa. So, the Korax cabinet is actually controlled by Mrs. Gal, Agwell, you could say that, but the war 7 years ago definitely started because of a female Kappa. Agwa. This country has wars. Of course. And there may be more in the future. As long as there are neighboring country Saka. I then learned, for the first time, that the Kappa country wasn't isolated. According to Gal, Kappas consider otters their hypothetical enemy. And otters, it seems, are just as well armed as Kappas. I was quite intrigued by the story of the Kappa-Otter War. After all, the existence of otters as a formidable enemy of Kappas was a new fact, unknown even to the authors of Agsuiko Koryakua and Agsent. Mintanch, or even Mr. Kunio Yanagita. Before the war broke out, both countries were wary of each other, neither daring to make a move, because both were equally afraid of the other. Then, an otter visited a Kappa couple in this country. The female Kappa was planning to murder her husband. He was a philanderer, you see. And the fact that he had life insurance might have been a slight temptation. Did you know this couple? Eyes. Well, I knew the male. My wife calls him a villain, but as far as I am concerned, he was more of a paranoid madman, terrified of being captured by a female Kappa. So, the female Kappa poisoned her husband Af's cocoa. But somehow, She accidentally gave it to the otter guest. The otter, of course, died. And Thenica. Agand then the war started. Agais, unfortunately, the otter had been decorated. Soka. Ag which side won? Ag this country, of course. 369,500 Kappas bravely gave their lives. But compared to the enemy, our losses were insignificant. Almost every piece of fur in this country is otter fur. During the war, in addition to manufacturing glass, I also sent coal cinders to the front lines. Ag what were the coal cinders for? Ag for food, of course. We Kappas will eat anything when we're hungry. Ag thatafs. Please don't be offended, but thatafsak scandalous, even in our country. Agitafs scandalous here, too. But as long as I say it is, no one considers it a scandal. Mag, the philosopher, would say, speak your own evil, and evil will disappear. Af besides, I was motivated by patriotism as well as profit. Just then, a club attendant entered. He bowed to Gal and announced in a declamatory voice. Thereaf's a fire next door to your house. Ag fire. Fire, Gal jumped to his feet. I, too, stood up. But the attendant calmly added. Agitaf's been extinguished, sir. Gal, dismissing the attendant with a gesture, had an expression that was a mixture of laughter and tears. Seeing his face, I realized I had stopped resenting him, the glass company president. He was no longer a capitalist, but just a Kappa. User. Please continue to translate it. Model. 260.9s. Picked a winter rose from the vase and handed it to him. Again though the fire-af's out, your wife must be terribly frightened. Here, take this home to her. Thank you. Gal took my hand. Then, with a sudden grin, he whispered. Ag the house next door is one of my properties. I'll collect the insurance money. I still vividly remember Galaf's smile at that moment, a smile I could neither despise nor hate. Chapter 10. Agwataf's wrong. You seem awfully depressed today. The day after the fire, I said this to Lap, who was sitting in my living room, smoking a cigarette. He had one leg crossed over the other, his gaze fixed on the floor, his rotted beak almost invisible. Glap, what af's the matter? I repeated. Ago, it af's nothing, really. Justica. Lap finally looked up, his voice a mournful nasal whine. Ag today, I was looking out the window and casually remarked, the butterworts are in bloom. My sister suddenly turned pale and snapped, well, I suppose if I'm a butterwort af and my mother, who always favors my sister, started yelling at me, too. Agui would the butterworts blooming upset your sister? Agi donaft no. She probably took it to mean she'ft capture a male Kappa or something. Then my aunt, Wolf's always quarreling with my mother, joined in, and it turned into a huge fight. My father, Wolf's always drunk, heard the commotion and started hitting everyone indiscriminately. And to top it all off, my younger brother stole my mother-af's wallet and went off to the cinema or something. I just donaft know what to do. Marika. Lap buried his face in his hands and sobbed. I felt sorry for him, of course. I also remembered Talk's disdain for the family system. I patted Lap on the shoulder and tried to comfort him. Ag these things happen. Come on, cheer up. Agbutak, but if only my beak hadnaft rotted offaka. Agthref's nothing you can do about that now. Come on, letafs go to tokafs. Agtok despises me. I can aft abandon my family as boldly as he did. Agthan letafs go to krabakafs. Since the concert incident, I had become friends with Krabak, so I decided to take Lap to the great composeraf's house. Krabak lived far more luxuriously than Talk. Not in the same way as Gal, the capitalist, but his room was filled with antique Stanagra figurines and Persian pottery, and he had a Turkish-style sofa, and he always played with his children beneath a portrait of himself. But today, he was sitting with his arms crossed, a grim expression on his face. Scraps of paper littered the floor around him. Lap had met Krabak several times with Talk, but he seemed intimidated by Krabak's demeanor today. He bowed politely and sat quietly in the corner. Agwataf's wrong, Krabak. I addressed the composer almost as a greeting. Agwataf's wrong. Those idiotic critics. They say my lyrical poetry can oft compare to Tokaf's Ag but you are Frey a musician aka. AGI could tolerate that. But they say IFM not even worthy of being called a musician compared to LOC LOC was a composer often compared to Krabak. Since he wasn't a member of the Superman Club, I had never met him. I had, however, seen his photograph. A Kappa with an upturned beak and a rather peculiar face. A Glock is certainly talented. But his music lacks the modern passion that yours possesses. Agdo, you really think so? Ag absolutely. Krabak jumped to his feet, grabbed a Tanagra figurine, and smashed it on the floor. Lap, startled, cried out and made a move to flee. But Krabak gestured for us to calm down and then said coldly, Akthatafs because you, like the common folk, donaft have ears. IFM afraid of Lokaka. Agayu. Donaft be so modest. Agwofs being modest. If I were going to put on an act, I'd do it for the critics, not for you. Krabak, is a genius. In that respect, I don't fear LOC. Akthan, what are you afraid of? Aksamething unknown, something ak intangible. A force, Akstar, that controls LOC. AGI donaft quite follow. Akthan, let me put it this way. LOC is snaft influenced by me. But IFM unconsciously influenced by him. Akthatafs your sensitivityaka. Agliston. Itafs not about sensitivity. LOC calmly goes about his work, doing what only he can do. But I get agitated. From Lokaf's perspective, it might seem like a small difference, a single step. But to me, itafs a difference of 10 miles. Agbut your heroic symphonica. Krabak narrowed his eyes even further and glared at Lap. Ag, shut up. What do you know? I know LOC. I know him better than those dogs who grovel at his feet. Calm down, please. Ag, if I could calm down. I always think that some unknown force has placed LOC before me, to mock me, to taunt me. A Mag, the philosopher, knows all about these things. He just sits there under his stained glass lantern, reading his dusty old books. Agao so, Agave you seen his recent book, Eth Words of a Fulaf? Krabak handed me a book, or rather, tossed it at me. Then, crossing his arms, he said abruptly, Agwell, IF'll be going now. I decided to take the dejected Lap for a walk. The busy streets were lined with shops shaded by beech trees. We walked in silence. Then we ran into Talk, the poet, with his long hair. He took a handkerchief from his pouch and wiped his brow. Go, hello there. Itaf's been a while. I was just thinking of visiting Krabakaka. Not wanting to cause a quarrel between the two artists, I tactfully explained Krabakaf's bad mood. Aegis, that so? Then IF'll skip it. He's quite neurotic, you know. I haven't aft been sleeping well these past few weeks, myself. Agwi donaft you join us for a walk? Agno, not today. Talk suddenly grabbed my arm, his body drenched in cold sweat. Agwataf's wrong. Ag, what is it? I asked Lap. Ag, I thought I saw a green monkey poking its head out of the window of that car. Concerned, I suggested he see Dr. Chuck. But Talk refused, looking suspiciously from me to Lap. Ag, I'm not an anarchist, you know. Donaft forget that. Well, goodbye. I wouldn't trust Chuck as far as I could throw him. We watched Talk walk away. We? No, not Agway. A Lap was suddenly sprawled in the middle of the street, peering through his legs at the passing cars and pedestrians. Thinking he had gone mad, I pulled him up. This is naft funny. What are you doing? Lap rubbed his eyes and replied calmly. AGI was feeling depressed, so I thought IFD look at the world upside down. But itaf's still the same. Chapter 11. This is an excerpt from McGaff's Acthi Words of a Foolar. X. A fool always believes everyone else is a fool. X. We love nature, perhaps, because it doesn't hate or envy us. X. The wisest way to live is to despise the customs of your time, yet never break them. X. We are proudest of only what we do not possess. X. No one objects to destroying idols. At the same time, no one objects to becoming an idol. But those who can comfortably sit on the pedestal are the most blessed by the gods, fools, villains, or heroes. Krabak had scratched this passage with his claws. X. The thoughts necessary for our lives may have been exhausted 3,000 years ago. We merely add new flames to old firewood. X. Our defining characteristic is our tendency to transcend our own consciousness. X. If happiness is accompanied by pain, and peace by boredom, then what? X. It is more difficult to defend oneself than to defend others. The doubters should observe lawyers. X. Pride, lust, doubt, all sins for 3,000 years have stemmed from these three. And perhaps all virtues as well. X. Reducing material desires does not necessarily bring peace. To achieve peace, we must also reduce spiritual desires. Krabak had also scratched this passage. X. We are more unfortunate than humans. Humans are not as evolved as Kappas. I couldn't help but laugh when I read this. X. To do is to be able to do, and to be able to do is to do. Ultimately, our lives cannot escape this circular reasoning, that is, they are fundamentally irrational. X. After Baudelaire became senile, he expressed his philosophy of life in a single word, vagina. But those who speak of him do not necessarily say this. Rather, they believed in his genius, his poetic genius sufficient to sustain his life, and forgot the word stomach. This passage also bore the marks of Krabak's claws. X. If we were to follow reason to its logical conclusion, we would have to deny our own existence. Voltaire, who made reason his god, lived happily ever after, which demonstrates that humans are not as evolved as Kappas. Chapter 12. One rather chilly afternoon, having grown tired of reading The Words of a Fool, I decided to visit Mag. At a quiet street corner, I saw a mosquito-thin Kappa leaning against a wall. It was the same Kappa who had stolen my fountain pen. I saw my chance and called out to a sturdy policeman passing by. Officer, please question that Kappa. He stole my fountain pen about a month ago. The policeman raised his stick. Policemen in this country carry you sticks instead of swords, and called out, Aggie, you are. I thought the Kappa might run away, but he calmly approached the policeman. He crossed his arms and stared defiantly at us. The policeman, unfazed, took out his notebook and began his interrogation. Your name? Agluk. Ag occupation? Ag. Until a few days ago, I was a mail carrier. Ag. Very well. This gentleman claims you stole his fountain pen. Ag. I stole it about a month ago. Agui. AGI wanted it as a toy for my child. Ag. And where is this child? The policeman finally looked sharply at the Kappa. Age died a week ago. Ag. Do you have a death certificate? The thin Kappa produced a piece of paper from his pouch. The policeman examined it and then, with a grin, patted the Kappa on the shoulder. Agel right. You are free to go. I stared at the policeman, dumbfounded. The thin Kappa muttered something and walked away. I collected my thoughts and asked the policeman. Agui didn't after you arrest him? Agif's innocent. Ag. But he stole my fountain penaka. Age said it was a toy for his child. But the child is dead. If you have any doubts, consult Penal Code 1285. The policeman walked away. I had no choice but to repeat Ag Penal Code 1285 to myself as I hurried to Mag's house. Mag, the philosopher, enjoyed having guests. Today, his dimly lit room was filled with Judge Pep, Dr. Chuck, and Gal, the president of the glass company, all gathered under the 7-colored stained glass lantern, smoking. Pepaf's presence was particularly fortuitous. As soon as I sat down, I asked him, Ag Pep, forgive me for being blunt, but don't after you punish criminals in this country. Pep exhaled a cloud of smoke from his gold-tipped cigarette and replied indifferently. Of course we punish them. We even have the death penalty. Ag. But about a month ago I explained the incident and asked about Penal Code 1285. Let me see. It states, regardless of the crime committed, if the circumstances that led to the crime no longer exist, the perpetrator shall not be punished. If in your case, the Kappa was a parent, but he no longer is a parent. Therefore, the crime has effectively vanished. Ag. That's absurd. Agden T be ridiculous. Itaf's absurd to treat a Kappa who was a parent the same as a Kappa who is a parent. Oh, I see. Japanese law treats them the same. How amusing. Ha 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 ha. Pep tossed his cigarette aside and chuckled softly. Then Chuck, who usually stayed out of legal discussions, adjusted his pince-nez and asked me, Agdo, you have the death penalty in Japan? Ah. Of course. Itaf's by hanging. Feeling slightly antagonistic towards Pep, I couldn't resist adding a touch of sarcasm. I presume the death penalty in this country is more civilized than in Japan. Ah. It is, most certainly. Pep remained unfazed. Agwe don't hang people. Occasionally, we use electricity. But usually, we don't even need that. We simply tell the criminal the name of their crime. Agand thataf's enough to kill a Kappa. Ah. It is. Our nervous systems are far more sensitive than yours. Agthataf's not just for capital punishment. They use that method for murder. Tuakagal, his face bathed in the light from the stained glass lantern, gave me a friendly smile. Just the other day, a socialist called me a ethif AF and I almost had a heart attack. That seems to be quite common. A lawyer I knew died that way. I glanced at the Kappa who had spoken, Mag, the philosopher. He had his usual cynical smile, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. That Kappa was called a Ifrogaf by someone. You know, of course, that in this country, being called a Ifrogaf means being less than human. He kept obsessing over whether or not he was a frog, and eventually died. Agso, it was suicide. Actually, the person who called him a frog intended to kill him. But from your perspective, it would still be considered suicidika. Just as Mag said this, a sharp pistol shot rang out from the house next door, Talk's house. Chapter 13. We rushed to Talk's house. Talk was lying on his back among the potted alpine plants, a pistol clutched in his right hand, blood oozing from the dish on his head. Beside him, a female Kappa sobbed loudly, her face buried in his chest. I lifted the female Kappa, although I wasn't fond of touching their slimy skin, and asked, what happened? Agi don't know. He was writing something, and then he suddenly shot himself. Oh, what am I going to do? Kurara. This is the sound of a Kappa crying. Arge was always so selfish. A Gal, the glass company president, shook his head sadly, addressing Judge Pep. But Pep remained silent, lighting another gold-tipped cigarette. Chuck, who had been kneeling beside Talk, examining his wound, announced to the five of us, actually, 1 human and 4 Kappas. Agitaf's no use. He had a weak stomach, which made him prone to melancholy. A guy who said he was writing something. A Mag, as if offering an explanation, picked up a piece of paper from the desk. We all craned our necks, except for me, of course, and peered over McGaff's broad shoulders at the paper. Now I will depart. To the valley beyond this world where rocks are jagged and waters clear. And medicinal herbs bloom fragrantly. Mag turned to us with a wry smile. Agitaf's a plagiarism of Gerthef's E. Mignonaf's song F. It seems his suicide was due to poetic exhaustion. Just then, Krabak arrived in his car. He paused at the doorway, taking in the scene. Then he walked towards us and addressed Mag in an almost accusatory tone. Aegis that Tokaf's will, Agno, Itaf's the poem he was writing just before he died. Arga poem, Mag, still calm, handed the poem to Krabak, whose hair was standing on end. Krabak read the poem intently, ignoring Mag's attempts to engage him in conversation. Ag, what do you make of Tokaf's death? Agno, I will depart. I, too, could die any day. To the valley beyond this world. Ag, but you were one of his closest friends, weren't you? A closest friends. Talk was always Alaniac to the valley beyond this world. Itaf's just that talk, unfortunate Liaka. Ag, unfortunately, Ag, where rocks are jagadak you are fortunatique where rocks are jagadaka. Feeling sorry for the still sobbing female Kappa, I put my arm around her shoulders and led her to a sofa in the corner of the room. There, a 2 or 3-year-old Kappa sat, blissfully unaware of what had happened. I played with the child to distract the grieving mother. Tears welled up in my eyes. This was the only time I cried during my stay in the Kappa country. Adjectives tragic for the family left behind when someone so selfish commits suicide. Arge didn't think about the consequences. Our Judge Pep lit another cigarette and spoke to Gal. Then Krabakav's voice startled us. Clutching the poem, he said to no one in particular. Age excellent. This will make a splendid funeral march. His narrow eyes gleaming, he shook Mag's hand briefly and rushed out the door. By now, a crowd of Kappas had gathered outside, peering curiously inside. Krabak shoved them aside and jumped into his car. The car roared to life and sped away. Aggie, hey, no peeking. A Judge Pep pushed the Kappas back and closed the door. The room suddenly became quiet. In the silence, amid the scent of alpine flowers mingled with the smell of Tokaf's blood, we discussed what to do. But Mag, the philosopher, just stared blankly at Talk's body, lost in thought. I touched his shoulder. Ag, what are you thinking about? Ag, about Kappa life. Ag, what about it? Ag, for us Kappas to truly live a Kappa life. Mag added softly, almost shyly, Agwe must believe in a power beyond ourselves. Chapter 14. Magaff's words made me think about religion. Being a materialist, I had never given religion much thought. But Tokaf's death, and the emotions it stirred within me, prompted me to wonder about Kappa religion. I asked Lap about it. Agwe have Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, but the most influential is modernism, or, as itaf's also known, the way of life. The term Agwe of lifea might not be accurate. The original word is kwemucha. Agcha is equivalent to the English ageism. Kumu, from the root word kumel, means not just to live but to eat, drink, and copulate. Ag, so you have churches and temples here? Ag, of course. The Grand Temple of Modernism is one of the largest buildings in the country. Why don't we go and have a look? One mild, overcast afternoon, Lap proudly led me to the Grand Temple. It was indeed a massive structure, 10 times the size of the Nikolai Cathedral. It incorporated every architectural style imaginable. Standing before it, gazing up at the towering spires and domes, I felt a sense of unease. It resembled a monstrous creature with countless tentacles reaching towards the sky. We stood at the entrance, how small we felt compared to the massive doorway, and stared up at this extraordinary edifice, more akin to a monstrous being than a building. The interior was equally vast. Numerous Kappas walked among the Corinthian columns. But even they looked tiny in this immense space. We encountered a stooped Kappa. Lap bowed his head slightly and addressed the Kappa politely. Elder, it's good to see you in good health. The Kappa bowed in return and replied politely. Lap, is that you? You, too, seem to be doing well. He paused, noticing Lap's rotted beak. Well, you seem healthy enough. But what brings you here today? IAFM accompanying this gentleman. You probably know him. Lap proceeded to tell the elder about me, seemingly using the opportunity to explain his own infrequent visits to the temple. Could you please show him around? The elder smiled graciously, greeted me, and gestured towards the altar. I'm afraid there's not much to show. We worshippers venerate the tree of life at the altar. As you can see, it bears gold and green fruit. The gold fruit is called the fruit of good, and the green fruit the fruit of evil. I was already bored. The elder's explanation sounded like a tired old metaphor. I pretended to listen attentively while occasionally glancing around the interior of the temple. Corinthian columns, Gothic vaults, Arabian-style checkered floors, secessionist-inspired prayer desks. Their eclectic mix created a strangely barbaric beauty. But what caught my attention were the marble busts in the niches along the walls. I felt like I recognized them. And no wonder. After explaining the tree of life, the stooped Kappa led us to a niche on the right and said, Akthis is one of our saints, Strindberg, the saint who rebelled against everything. He suffered greatly and is said to have found salvation in Swedenborgaf's philosophy. But he wasn't truly saved. He simply believed in the way of life, like us, or rather, he had no choice but to believe. Read his book, Elegends.af. He himself confessed to being a suicide attempter. Feeling slightly melancholic, I looked at the next niche. It contained a bust of a German man with a thick mustache. Akthis is Nietzsche, the poet of Zarathustra. He sought salvation in the Superman he himself created. But he wasn't saved, and he went mad. Perhaps if he hadn't gone mad, he wouldn't be considered a saint. The elder paused and led us to the third niche. This is Tolstoy. He practiced asceticism more than any other. Being an aristocrat, he couldn't bear to show his suffering to the curious public. He tried to believe in Christ, whom he actually didn't believe in. He even publicly professed his faith. But in his later years, he couldn't bear the burden of his lies. It's well known that he was sometimes terrified of the rafters in his study. But he's considered a saint, so he didn't commit suicide, of course. The bust in the fourth niche was of a Japanese man. Seeing a familiar face, I felt a pang of nostalgia. This is Doppo Kunikida, a poet who truly understood the feelings of a laborer about to be run over by a train. I'm sure you don't need any further explanation. Now, look at the fifth nichika. Agesnaft that Wagner, Agais. A revolutionary who was a friend of the king. Saint Wagner even said grace before meals in his later years. But he was, of course, a follower of the way of life, not Christianity. According to his letters, he was frequently tempted by suicide. We were now standing before the sixth niche. This is a friend of Saint Strindberg. A French painter, formerly a merchant, who married a 13 or 14-year-old girl named Kitty instead of his wife, who had many children. He had the blood of a sailor coursing through his veins. But look at his lips. You can still see traces of arsenic or some other poison. In the seventh nichik, but I'm sure you are tired. Please, come this way. I was indeed tired, so I followed the elder, along with Lap, down a fragrant corridor and into a room. In the corner of the small room, a bunch of wild grapes was offered beneath a statue of a black Venus. I had expected a Spartan monastic cell and was surprised by the decor. The elder, sensing my surprise, offered us chairs and explained, with a slightly apologetic tone, please remember that our religion is the way of life. The teachings of our God, the tree of life, are live life to the fullest. Afaklap, have you shown him our scriptures? Agnoak, I haven't really read them myself. A Lap scratched his head and replied honestly. The elder smiled serenely and continued. Then you wouldn't understand. Our God created the world in a single day. The tree of life, despite being called a tree, may or may not actually be a tree. He also created the female Kappa. The female Kappa, bored, longed for a male companion. Our God, taking pity on her, took some of her brain matter and created the male Kappa. He then blessed the two Kappas, saying, eat, copulate, and live life to the fullest. Afa. The elder's words reminded me of Talk. He, like me, was an atheist. As a non-Kappa, my ignorance of the way of life was understandable. But Talk, born in the Kappa country, should have known about the tree of life. I felt sorry for Talk, who hadn't followed its teachings, and interrupted the elder. Aga, yes, that poor poet. The elder sighed. Aga fate is determined by faith, circumstance, and chance. You humans also include heredity, I believe. Talk, unfortunately, lacked faith. Agtok envied you. In fact, I envy you, too. Lap is still younger. Perhaps I would have been more optimistic if my beak had naftica. The elder sighed again, his eyes welling up with tears as he stared at the black Venus. Actually, too, this is a secret, so please don't tell anyone. I, too, find it difficult to believe in our God. But still, my precious. Just then, the door burst open, and a large female Kappa lunged at the elder. We tried to restrain her, but she threw the elder to the floor. Agayu, old fool. You stole money from my purse again, About 10 minutes later, we practically fled the temple, leaving the elderly Kappa couple behind. Agitafs, no wonder he doesn't believe in the tree of life. After walking in silence for a while, Lap said this to me. I didn't reply, but I couldn't help but glance back at the grand temple. It loomed against the overcast sky, its towers and domes like countless tentacles, resembling a mirage shimmering in the desert air. Chapter 15. About a week later, I heard a strange story from Dr. Chuck. Talk's house was apparently haunted. The female Kappa had moved out, and the poet's former home had been converted into a photographer's studio. According to Chuck, whenever a photograph was taken in the studio, a faint image of talk would appear behind the subject. Chuck, being a materialist, didn't believe in life after death. He told the story with a malicious grin, adding, "It seems that even souls are material. I, too, was skeptical about ghosts. But I had felt a certain fondness for talk, so I went to a bookstore and bought all the newspapers and magazines carrying articles and photos of Talk's ghost. The photos did indeed show a Kappa resembling Talk, faintly visible behind various Kappa men, women, and children. But what surprised me more than the photos were the articles, particularly the report by the Psychical Research Society. IAFA translated a portion of the report as accurately as possible. The parenthetical remarks are my own. Report on the Ghost of the Poet Talk, Psychical Research Society Journal, number 8274. Our Psychical Research Society recently held a special investigation at number 251, AA Street, the former residence of the late poet Talk, now a photography studio operated by Mr. XX. The following members were present, names omitted. Point 17 of our members, along with Society President Peck, gathered in a room at the studio at 10:30 a.m. on September 17, accompanied by our most trusted medium, Mrs. Hop. Upon entering the studio, Mrs. Hop immediately sensed a spiritual presence, experiencing convulsions and vomiting repeatedly. According to her, this was due to the strong nicotine content of the spiritual atmosphere, a result of the poet Tokaf's heavy smoking. We sat in silence around a circular table with Mrs. Hop. After 3 minutes and 25 seconds, she entered a trance state and became possessed by the spirit of Talk. Our members, in order of seniority, began the following dialogue with Talk's spirit. Question: Why do you appear as a ghost? A. To witness my posthumous fame. Q. Do you, or rather, do spirits, desire fame even after death? A. I, at least, do not desire it. However, a Japanese poet I encountered despised posthumous fame. Q. Do you know this poet's name? A. I am afraid I have forgotten. I only remember one of his 17-syllable poems. Q. What is the poem? A. Agon old silent pondak a frog jumps into the pond. Splash. Silence again. R. Question: Do you consider it a good poem? A. I do not necessarily consider it a bad poem. However, if Agfroga were replaced with a Kappa R, it would be far more brilliant. Q. Why is that? A. We Kappas insist on the presence of Kappas in all art. At this point, President Peck reminded us that this was a special investigation, not a poetry critique. Question: What is life like for spirits? A. Not unlike your own. Q. Do you regret your suicide? A. Not necessarily. If I grow tired of spiritual life, I'll simply pick up a pistol and kill myself again. Q. Is it easy to kill oneself? Tokaf's spirit answered this question with another question, a typical response for those who knew him. A. Is it easy to commit suicide? Q. Are your lives eternal? A. Regarding the lives of spirits, there are various conflicting theories, none of which are reliable. Fortunately, we have various religions among us, including Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and Zoroastrianism. Q. What do you believe? A. I am a skeptic. Q. But surely you do not doubt the existence of spirits? A. I am not as certain as you are. Q. How many friends do you have? A. I have friends throughout history and across the world, no fewer than 300. Among the most famous are Kleist, Meyrink, Weiningerak. Question: Are all your friends suicides? A. Not necessarily. Montaigne, who defended suicide, is one of my closest friends. However, I do not associate with pessimistic philosophers who have never attempted suicide, like Schopenhauer. Q. Is Schopenhauer still alive? A. He is currently establishing a spiritual pessimism and debating the feasibility of suicide. He seems quite relieved to have learned that cholera is a bacterial disease. We continued to inquire about the spirits of Napoleon, Confucius, Dostoevsky, Darwin, Cleopatra, Buddha, Demosthenes, Dante, Sen-no Rikyu, and others. However, Talk was unable to provide detailed answers. Instead, he asked us about various gossip concerning himself. Q. What is being said about me now? A. One critic called you a Agmana poet. R. A. He must resent me for not sending him a copy of my poetry collection. Has my complete works been published? Q. Yes, but it has not sold very well. A. My complete works will be read by everyone 300 years from now, when the copyright expires. How is my girlfriend doing? A. She married the publisher, lac.a. She probably still doesn't know about Locaf's glass eye. What about my child? A. I hear he's in the National Orphanage. After a moment of silence, Talk asked another question. Q. What about my house? A. It has a photography studio. Q. What has become of my desk? A. No one knows. A. In the drawer of my desk, I kept a bundle of letters, but fortunately, this is of no concern to you busy people. The spirit world is now fading into twilight. I must bid you farewell. Farewell, my good friends. Mrs. Hop abruptly awoke after these last words. We, the 17 members, swear to the heavens that this dialogue is true. Mrs. Hop was compensated at her former actress's daily rate. Chapter 16. After reading these articles, I grew increasingly weary of this country and longed to return to the human world. But no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find the hole I had fallen through. Bag, the fisherman, had mentioned an old Kappa who lived on the outskirts of town, spending his days reading, playing the flute, and living a quiet life. I thought he might know a way for me to escape, so I set out for the outskirts. However, when I arrived, the small house I found wasn't occupied by an old Kappa, but by a young one, no older than 12 or 13, casually playing the flute. I thought I must have come to the wrong house. But when I asked his name, it was indeed the old Kappa Bag had described. Ag, but you seem so youngaka. Agavnaft, you heard. I was born with a full head of white hair, and I have been getting younger ever since. Now I am like a child again. But if you count my age from before I was born, including 60 years in the womb, I am probably around 115 or 116 years old. I looked around the room. Perhaps it was my imagination, but a sense of serene happiness seemed to permeate the simply furnished space. Agayu seemed much happier than other Kappas. Agwell, perhaps I am. I was old when I was young, and young when I grew old. So, I am free from the desires of both the old and the young. My life, if not exactly happy, has certainly been peaceful. I can see why you aft be peaceful. Agthref's more to it than that. I have always been healthy, and I have enough wealth to live comfortably. But I believe my greatest fortune was being born old. We talked for a while about Tokaf's suicide and Garluf's constant medical checkups. But the old Kappa didn't seem particularly interested in my stories. Ag, so you don't aft particularly cling to life, like other Kappas. The old Kappa looked at me and replied calmly. Ag, like any other Kappa, I was asked by my father whether or not I wanted to be born before I left my mother's womb. Ag, but I fell into this country by accident. Please, tell me how to get out. Agthref's only one way out. Agand, that is, Ag, the same way you came in. A shiver ran down my spine. Agi Kanaft seemed to find that way. The old Kappa gazed at me with his clear, youthful eyes. Then he finally stood up, walked to the corner of the room, and pulled a rope hanging from the ceiling. A skylight I hadn't noticed before opened, revealing the clear blue sky beyond the branches of pine and cypress trees. I even saw the sharp, arrowhead-like peak of Mount Yari. I was overjoyed, like a child seeing an airplane for the first time. Agthir. That af's your way out. The old Kappa pointed at the rope. What I had thought was a rope was actually a rope ladder. Ag, thank you. I'll take my leave then. Just a word of warning. Don aft regret leaving. Agden aft worry, I won aft. I immediately started climbing the rope ladder, looking down at the dish on the old Kappa's head far below. Chapter 17. After returning from the Kappa country, I was initially overwhelmed by the smell of human skin. Compared to Kappas, humans are quite filthy. And human heads, after having grown accustomed to Kappa heads, looked strangely grotesque. You probably wouldn't understand. But aside from the eyes and mouth, the nose is a strangely disturbing feature. I tried to avoid human contact as much as possible. But gradually, I grew used to humans again, and after about 6 months, I was able to go out in public. However, I still had the problem of accidentally using Kappa language in conversation. Ag, will you be home tomorrow? Aqua. Agwat. Agi mean, yes. That sort of thing. About a year after returning from the Kappa country, a business venture failed, Andak, Drives interrupted him here, saying, "Let's skip that part." Apparently, whenever he talked about this, he became violently agitated. So, let us skip that part. But after the business failure, I started thinking about returning to the Kappa country. Not a going back, but returning. It had become something of a homeland to me. I secretly left my house, intending to take a train on the Chuo line. Unfortunately, I was apprehended by a policeman and brought here, to this hospital. Even after being admitted, I continued to think about the Kappa country. I wondered how Chuck was doing. Mag was probably still sitting under his 7-colored stained glass lantern, lost in thought. And Lap, my dear friend with the rotted beakak. It was a cloudy afternoon, like today. Lost in these memories, I was about to speak when I saw him. Bag, the fisherman Kappa, was standing before me, bowing repeatedly. I collected myself and I don't have to remember whether I laughed or cried, but I was certainly moved to be using the Kappa language again. Bag. What are you doing here? AGI came to visit you. I heard you were ill. Agao, did you know? AGI heard it on the radio news. A Bag grinned proudly. Agitaf's good to see you. Agit was no trouble at all. The rivers and canals of Tokyo are like highways for us Kappas. It suddenly dawned on me that Kappas, like frogs, are amphibious. But there are no rivers around here. AGI came through the water pipes. I just opened a fire hydrantica. Opened a fire hydrant. Agave you forgotten? We Kappas have engineers, too. After that, I received visits from various Kappas every few days. Drives says I have dementia precox. But Chuck, and I apologize if this offends you, says that I don't have dementia precox, that Drives and you are the ones with dementia precox. Since Chuck comes to visit, it havs no surprise that Lap and Mag do, too. But aside from Bag, they only come at night, especially on moonlit nights. Last night, I talked with Gal, Mag, and even Krabak, who played a violin piece for me. See that bouquet of black lilies on the table over there? Krabak brought it as a gift. I looked behind me. Of course, there was nothing on the table. And this book, too, Mag brought it for me. Take a look at the first poem. You wouldn't understand the Kappa language. Let me read it to you. It's from Talk's recently published complete works. He opened an old phone book and began to read aloud. Among the palm blossoms and bamboo, Buddha has long been sleeping. By the roadside, with the withered fig. Christ, too, seems to be dead, but we must rest. Even before the backdrop of a play, and if you look behind the backdrop, what do you see? Only a patched-up canvas. But I'm not a pessimist like that poet. As long as the Kappas come to visit Miko, I almost forgot. You remember Pep, the judge? He lost his job and actually went mad. I hear he's in a mental hospital in the Kappa country now. If Drives would allow it, I'd like to visit Himak. February 11, 1927.